Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 12 waiver wire targets for the 2022 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about prospects at the running back, wide receiver, tight end, quarterback, kicker, and defensive positions. These prospects will not only be able to be utilized this week as potential streaming options, but hopefully will gain momentum and value as we progress throughout the rest of the 2022 season and potentially be players that we can roster and even start for the remainder in order to help us capture a 2022 fantasy football championship. Now, many of us have usually had to deal with weekly turnover of players, but this week there are literally no teams on bye, which makes it that much easier to have a full, stable roster set and ready to go. But for those of you who are dealing with the various injuries that have taken place to your players, whether it was in Week 10 or this weekend in Week 11, which again, there were plenty of, which we'll mention in just a moment. Of course, hopefully these potential stash options and or streaming options will give you some sort of variety of players that you can go ahead pick up for this week's waiver wire. Now, some of the injuries that did occur in Week 11 that may impact us going forward are guys like Mike Williams and his ankle injury re-aggravated. Kadarius Toney, I don't know if this is a new or potentially his old hamstring injury that was re-aggravated as well. Matthew Stafford with a concussion, as well as Joe Mixon with a concussion. Kyle Pitts with a knee injury. Of course, we had Wan'Dale Robinson, confirmed season-ending ACL injury. Jaylen Warren with a hamstring injury. We had Justin Fields with a left shoulder injury. And of course, many of us are still trying to work through the aftermath of losing Cooper Kupp on our rosters, and potentially that being the case for the remainder of the season. Either way, hopefully today's video will give you guys my opinion on these players and the statistics as to why I want to go ahead and go after them. If I can steer you in the right direction in terms of waiver wire pickups, hopefully it can help you for the remainder of the season. Before we begin, again, for the remainder of the season, I'll be making daily fantasy football content. So if you have not yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel instead of live streaming later tonight, because there's a lot of potential videos to put out from now until Thursday, because you got to remember, Thursday, Thanksgiving, there are 3 games on that given day. I will be live streaming Thursday morning from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. After we talk about waiver wire prospects at the beginning of today's episode, at the very end, we'll talk about some potential prize pick entries for tonight's Monday Night Football game. All right, let's talk about some potential waiver wire pickups going into Week 12, beginning at the running back position. We're going to start by talking about Latavius Murray. Latavius Murray is currently only rostered in 23% of leagues. And like I typically like to do throughout my weekly waiver wire episode, is give you guys prospects that are not rostered in more than 50% of Yahoo formats, because typically, if they're rostered in more than 50%, majority of us already have them taken in our given leagues. Currently, again, Latavius Murray, only rostered in 23% of leagues, has pretty much established himself as the number 1 running back of this team. Now, the biggest news from yesterday's game was the fact that Nathaniel Hackett, the head coach of the Denver Broncos, he gave up his play calling duties and gave that to Clint Kubiak. He's the former offensive coordinator of the Minnesota Vikings in 2021, and we know how much they wanted to utilize the running game in that offense. So immediately we expected Melvin Gordon will probably take the number 1 overall reps, and Latavius Murray would obviously get himself utilization. But I purely didn't expect it to be so heavily favored in the direction of Latavius Murray. In yesterday's game, Latavius Murray played 32 total snaps, which led to 21 opportunities and 21 total touches. 17 on the ground for 49 yards and a touchdown. 4 targets, 4 catches, 23 yards, and 15.2 fantasy points. He was given the lone red zone rushing attempt early in that game, and Melvin Gordon was not, which is obviously one of the biggest difference makers. Now, Melvin Gordon played his fair share of snaps, played 29, only 3 less than Latavius Murray, led to 13 total opportunities, which is a combination of targets and rushing attempts, which was a total of 5 targets and 8 total rushing attempts. Overall, a pretty good week for both of these running backs, but going forward, Latavius Murray, in my eyes, is going to be the primary back here. This has been a consecutive weekly basis as we have seen Latavius Murray be a functioning and stable running back in the fantasy football space in a half PPR scoring format. We absolutely want guys like this because many of us are still dealing with the inconsistencies of other players, and hopefully players like Latavius Murray can step in as a RB3 option, potential flex option within a given week in a great matchup. Moving on, let's talk about Cam Akers. This entire Rams backfield is a mess, but I do want to talk about Cam Akers in specific. First and foremost, he's currently only rostered in 27% of leagues, and he's coming off of a week in which he led all the running backs in this offense in terms of total touches. 14 total rushing attempts for 61 total yards. That is it. 6.1 fantasy points. Now, just to give you some perspective, the game began with Darrell Henderson as the starting running back, having 2 rushing attempts on the first drive for 9 yards. 1 rushing attempt for 5 and the other one for 4. Okay, pretty good start. Then all of a sudden, we didn't see, for the remainder of the game, Darrell Henderson play. He only played 4 total snaps in that game. So I'm beginning to think maybe he got injured or they just completely benched him and they were done with him after the first drive, which is pretty ridiculous to me. But then henceforth, we saw Cam Akers play 25 snaps. And of course, Kyren Williams played 35 snaps. And we'll talk about Kyren Williams in just a moment. But it seems to me that Cam Akers has established himself within the Matthew Stafford-led offense, specifically early in that game prior to Matthew Stafford leaving the game due to that concussion. Cam Akers was the starting running back of this team and was dominating the rushing attempts going forward. Now, obviously, let's mention Kyren Williams because he does have value going into future weeks. But Kyren Williams is pretty much established himself, in my eyes, as the receiving back of this offense. So not only is he going to get the targets out of this backfield, a couple sprinkles of rushing attempts, but predominantly he's going to be a pass blocking threat as well. So the fact that Kyren Williams ended up playing 35 of the total offensive snaps, while Cam Akers only played 25, doesn't really bother me considering majority of the opportunities were still going in the direction of Cam Akers. Both these guys are probably available in your leagues, but in my opinion, I'd rather have Cam Akers. Let's move on. Let's talk about Samaje Perine, our number 3. Samaje Perine is currently only rostered in 8% of leagues, and the primary reason we have to mention him is because Joe Mixon obviously in that second quarter left the game due to a concussion. Did not return. And there is a potential that if Joe Mixon stays within concussion protocol, he will miss this upcoming weekend's game against the Tennessee Titans. And if that's going to be the case, you're going to miss out on a lot of points because in the absence of Joe Mixon, we saw Samaje Perine collect 28.2 half PPR fantasy points, 3 receiving touchdowns on 4 total receptions and 52 receiving yards, 11 rushing attempts for 30 yards. When you're getting yourself 15 touches and 3 touchdowns, I don't care which running back you are, you got to be on my roster. And the fact that there's a potential for those of us who have Joe Mixon to lose out on value because we don't have our handcuff on roster should be more important than anything. This is a main priority conversation in regards to the remainder of the season. You need to have your handcuffs on roster. Whether it is Alexander Mattison or Isaiah Spiller like we talked about last week, or guys like Samaje Perine, Dontrell Hilliard. There are so many potential upside players that are associated with handcuffs that, yes, aren't big name players, that are not going to have value outside of a potential injury taking place. But if you can go ahead, add these players to the back end of your bench for the remainder of the season, that insurance policy could absolutely win you a given year. So make sure to go ahead, have your handcuffs on roster, and specifically for those of you who need Samaje Perine potentially this week, if in fact Joe Mixon does not clear concussion protocol, be sure to go ahead and pick him up this week. Only rostered in 8% of leagues on Yahoo. All right, so that'll cover it for the running back position. Let's transition into talking about a couple wide receivers. We're going to talk about a total of 8 wide receivers today, beginning with our number 1, Treylon Burks. Treylon Burks, the rookie wide receiver, had himself his breakout game on Thursday night against the Green Bay Packers. A really good secondary, yet he was still able to manage 8 total targets to led to 7 receptions and 111 receiving yards. 2 of those plays being major contributions to his overall scoreline. But if you're able to get him involved in the deep passing game, you got to remember, guys, this was the guy that was supposed to come in and take over for A.J. Brown's role. They traded A.J. Brown for the first round pick, and they used it on Treylon Burks. Treylon Burks, who is currently rostered in 20% of formats, in my mind, has a lot of upside for potentially being one of those rookies that in the late half of the season has he break out couple games and takes over this given offense. I mean, when he's competing with guys like Robert Woods, Nick Westbrook, again, those players are going to garner targets, but they want Treylon Burks to be the guy. And hopefully Ryan Tannehill plays as well as he did on Thursday night against Green Bay in future weeks. Takes on Cincinnati this week. Should be a great overall contest for not only Treylon Burks, but this offense as a whole. Let's move on to Donovan Peoples-Jones. I mention him every single week. We'll continue to do so until his number surpasses that 50% rostership percentage via Yahoo, currently at 45%. So many of us have already gone ahead and done so after me touting his name for 8 consecutive weeks here. Again, since week 4, he has been averaging 6.57 targets, 4.71 receptions, 72.43 receiving yards, and 10.2 fantasy points per game and a half PPR scoring format. He is coming off of a performance against the Buffalo Bills of all defense, in which he had himself 14.6 fantasy points, his season high in fantasy points. And in the last 2 weeks, he's been able to put together both season highs. Fantastic. But the biggest difference maker is that he scored a touchdown this week. It finally happened. He found the end zone. Going forward, we're not only going to see this momentum continue for Donovan Peoples-Jones, but we're, in my opinion, going to potentially see the return of Deshaun Watson elevate his overall value. Jacoby Brissett is playing out of his mind as of late, and until week 13, we're going to continue to prosper from that. But after that, we're going to have the potential upside of Deshaun Watson in the fantasy playoffs, as their schedule consists of the Baltimore Ravens, New Orleans Saints, and Washington Commanders. They're pretty tough run defenses. Again, those defenses like to stop the run, specifically Baltimore and Washington this year. So if in fact Nick Chubb is going to stall in any sort of capacity, Deshaun Watson is going to air it out to guys like Donovan Peoples-Jones and of course Amari Cooper. But as of right now, Donovan should be a pickup, absolutely. Moving on to Parris Campbell. Before we switch off to the next screen and panel in terms of other players, we of course have to mention Parris Campbell. This is a 4th consecutive game with Matt Ryan in which he had 5 or more receptions and 57 or more receiving yards. Those potential base minimums in a half PPR scoring format aren't the greatest, but with the amount of potential upside he's had in the red zone as a receiving threat that has caught 3 touchdowns in his last 4 games with Matt Ryan, of course, there's a lot of upside. He's coming off a performance in which he had 5 catches for 67 yards, was able to get himself 9.2 fantasy points. We're hoping for more upside in the upcoming weeks. But again, he's a primary, threat within this offense. So as long as we continue to see targets from Matt Ryan going in his direction, he's a fantastic fantasy value going forward, especially in a full PPR scoring format. So let's talk about the second half of the wide receiver conversation with Odell Beckham Jr. as our number 4. Odell Beckham Jr. is currently not rostered on a team. He is not signed yet, but the expectation is that he's going to visit a couple teams throughout this week and then decide next week as to where he wants to go. He spent the last couple weeks in terms of getting into full football shape. All he needs to do is then arrive to a team, get himself the playbook, and hopefully by week 13 or 14, we'll be ready to go as a full level capacity, wide receiver 2 option. We saw him join the Rams and immediately make an impact. So if he's able to join the Dallas Cowboys, the Kansas City Chiefs, some of these other upper tier teams that love to throw the ball, why not go ahead and have him rostered? He's currently only rostered in 43% of leagues, probably already taken in your league, but if, again, you have the opportunity of picking him up, you absolutely need to do so because we know how much potential upside value OBJ has. Moving on to Darius Slayton. Again, with Wan'Dale Robinson having a season-ending ACL injury, Darius Slayton's value only continues to skyrocket. In 5 out of the last 6 games, Darius Slayton has produced 9 or more fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. He's coming off of a week in which he had 86 receiving yards, 5 catches on 10 targets, 11.1 fantasy points. With little wide receiver target competition within this offense, Darius Slayton continues to be the primary number 1. Moving on to our number 6, Skyy Moore. With Kadarius Toney pretty much leaving that game with a hamstring early, we potentially saw more Justin Watson and Skyy Moore. But if in fact we see Juju Smith-Schuster return to the roster next week, I think Justin Watson will disappear and we'll see far more utilization out of Skyy Moore, while McCole Hardman is on the injured reserve, and of course Kadarius Toney's dealing with his hamstring injury, which has plagued him over the last 2 years. Skyy Moore, 6 targets, 5 catches, 63 yards, gets himself some utilization on special teams as a return specialist. But considering we're going to have so many of these receiving options for Kansas City out, it doesn't really matter to me who is going to be filling the position. Considering the offense that they're associated with and the quarterback they're associated with, there's a lot of high upside going forward for Skyy Moore, the rookie wide receiver. Moving on to Demarcus Robinson. Demarcus Robinson has had himself 6 or more catches in 2 out of the last 3 games that he has played. He's coming off of a week in which he had 9 targets, 9 catches, and 128 receiving yards against the Carolina Panthers defense. Now, Devin Duvernay completely disappeared in this contest, and outside of Demarcus Robinson, there really wasn't anybody else that we could trust as a receiving option at the wide receiver position for this offense. We know that, Rashad Bateman is out for the year, and if Demarcus Robinson is going to be that play guy for the remainder of the season, only rostered in 4% of leagues, not a bad option going forward. Let's move on to Terrace Marshall. Terrace Marshall, again, has had himself pretty consistent weeks here. 3 out of the last 4 games of 9 or more fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. And if that'll continue to be the case, regardless of who's at quarterback, whether it's Baker Mayfield, Sam Darnold, or PJ Walker, there's a lot of potential for us to go ahead, stash this player as a wide receiver 3 option and or flex play in good matchups going forward, which again, he has many of in the upcoming games. Specifically not this upcoming week, considering they take on Denver. But to be totally honest, if DJ Moore is pulling Patrick Surtain on the other side of the field, we could see majority of the potential targets go in the direction of Terrace Marshall once again this upcoming week. All right, let's go ahead and move on, and let's start talking about some potential quarterback streaming options going into week 12. Beginning with our number 1, Marcus Mariota. Marcus Mariota takes on the Washington Commanders. Again, he's coming off of another week in which he had a great performance. Now, if you go ahead and look at his streak of games since week 5, Marcus Mariota, in a standard 4-point per passing touchdown format, has been the number 12 overall quarterback in fantasy points per game, averaging 17.09. He's been able to put up over 17.5 fantasy points in 5 out of his last 7 games, with a great matchup against a secondary that isn't great and against a run-stopping defense that has been better over the course of the last couple weeks here. I expect to see a lot of utilization from Marcus Mariota's arm, throwing it to whether it is Drake London, Damiere Byrd, hopefully Kyle Pitts healthy going into this upcoming week, currently rostered in 43% of leagues. Obviously should already have been rostered, and if he's not yet already, Be sure to have him. Moving on, we're talking about Ryan Tannehill, our number 2, currently only rostered in 16% of leagues, coming off of an incredible performance. Now, this is 2 consecutive weeks now against pretty good secondaries, Denver and Green Bay, that Ryan Tannehill has had himself fantasy relevant weeks, 19 plus fantasy points in both of these consecutive games. And he's coming off of a specific performance on Thursday night in which he had 333 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, and an 81.5% passing completion percentage. Ryan Tannehill now building more and more rapport with guys like Treylon Burks, of course, Robert Woods, Nick Westbrook-Ikhine. Going forward, should be a fantastic option against the Cincinnati Bengals defense. Again, maybe a revenge game from the last time these two teams faced in the NFL playoffs, where we saw the number 1 seed Tennessee Titans lose to the Cincinnati Bengals last season, which was kind of rough in the playoffs. Moving on to Jacoby Brissett. Of course, we all know that Deshaun Watson will be returning soon, but Jacoby Brissett, in the meanwhile, has been a fantastic fantasy quarterback. In the last 3 games, he has put up 16 or more fantasy points in every single contest. And those last 3 games have not been easy contests, taking on Cincinnati, Miami, and Buffalo. Now, of course, this Buffalo game in which he had 3 passing touchdowns and 324 passing yards is no joke. He came out the gates hot and looked significantly better than I ever could have anticipated in regards to Jacoby Brissett just being himself. Again, throughout this entire season, he has been very inconsistent, but as of late, has gotten himself on track to being a quarterback that is not only reliable, has had himself a 68.4% passing completion percentage in his last 3 games, and has had himself 20 total rushing attempts in his last 3 games for 81 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. When you're getting the utilization through the air, on the ground, everything is working in his direction. Prior to the return of Deshaun Watson, has a lot of value, only rostered in 10% of leagues. Moving on to the tight end position, let's begin with Juwan Johnson. I didn't believe that it was going to happen, and it did. For those of you who went ahead and started him anyway, congratulations, you benefited from the fact that he found the end zone. Juwan Johnson has scored 5 touchdowns in his last 5 games. That is an unbelievable number. In the last 5 games, averaging 4.2 targets, 3.6 receptions, 36 receiving yards, and a touchdown per game, which has led to 11.28 half PPR fantasy points per game on average. Now he has to take on the San Francisco 49ers, and even though I thought the LA Rams matchup was going to be difficult, and the fact that they didn't have 3 starting offensive linemen, Andy Dalton had all the time in the world. And not only that, Juwan Johnson was able to get himself his red zone utilization as per usual. So regardless of the fact that they take on the San Francisco 49ers, and typically they're pretty stout against opposing tight ends in fantasy, doesn't matter. We're picking them up and playing them as of this moment in time going forward. Let's talk about Foster Moreau, our number 2 tight end. Foster Moreau, since week 8, has been number 6 amongst all tight ends in terms of total targets with 21, number 9 amongst all tight ends in terms of total receptions with 12, and number 8 amongst all tight ends in terms of receiving yards with 149. When you're in the top 10 conversation of all 3 of those primary statistics, of course, touchdowns eluding him at times, but he's been able to score a touchdown once in the last 2 weeks. The fact that he's being given that opportunity, getting the receptions and getting the yardage, he's obviously in the top 12 conversation for the remainder of the year, in my opinion, especially considering we have Zach Ertz, Dallas Goedert, both of them out for significant periods of time. Of course, Dallas Goedert will end up returning, but guys like Zach Ertz, he's out for the remainder of the season. So if you need a tight end option, Foster Moreau is the guy. Moving on to Austin Hooper. I was hoping that Austin Hooper would be more relevant earlier on in the season, especially considering the lack of receiving help that this offense has had. That all being mentioned, he's had himself 11 total targets in the last 2 weeks, coming off of a performance on Thursday Night Football in which he had himself 2 receiving touchdowns, one of them caught from a pass from Derrick Henry, the other, of course, from Ryan Tannehill. So considering his advanced rate of total opportunity, 11 targets, 9 receptions, 77 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns in the last 2 weeks. Overall, fantastic stats for those of you who are in desperate need of a tight end in a pretty deep league. Moving on, let's talk about some kickers and defenses, beginning with our number 1, Jason Myers. If someone dropped Jason Myers in your league, you should pick him up. He is currently the number 4 overall kicker in fantasy, and he's coming off a bye week for the Seattle Seahawks. Again, he's been a very consistent prospect all season long, averaging nearly 10 fantasy points per game. You should have him on roster going forward. Moving on to our number 2, we have Joey Sly. Joey Sly in the last 2 weeks has put up 19.0 and 12.0 fantasy points. The volume at which the Washington Commanders are kicking field goals is unbelievable. Going into this upcoming week, they take on the Atlanta Falcons. Should be an easier team to move the ball on, whether it's on the ground or through the air. Again, when he's available in 90% of formats and he's putting up this many fantasy points and they're kicking this many field goals, of course, we want to trust it. Moving on to Cameron Dicker. If, in fact, Dustin Hopkins, the primary starting kicker of the LA Chargers, does not return, Cameron Dicker has himself another opportunity this week against the Arizona Cardinals in which he has great upside. only rostered in 13% of leagues, is coming off of the last 3 games of 8, 12, and 10 total fantasy points. A great option for us, for those of us who are in need of kicker help. Moving on, let's talk about some defenses. The New York Jets, somehow, someway, are still only rostered in 46% of leagues. That number should be at 100% at this current moment in time. Since week 4, they have been the number 3 overall defense in terms of fantasy points per game this season, averaging 10.85. Now, again, they have great matchups upcoming. They take on the Chicago Bears this upcoming week, and even though Justin Fields is going to be running the ball all over the place, hopefully he's going to be playing. If he's not, then you're going to have the opportunity of playing the Jets up against Trevor Siemian of all quarterbacks, which would be a fantastic option there. Either way, they need to be rostered for the remainder of the season. Speaking of another defense, this week we have the Miami Dolphins. The Miami Dolphins take on the Houston Texans. It's one of the most advantageous matchups going into the week. There's a reason why we made the Washington Commanders defense last week a must-start play. Because again, they were taking on Houston. And Houston, right off the rip, Davis Mills throws a pick 6 to begin that game and began the avalanche of points that was for the Washington Commanders defense. As a whole, the Miami Dolphins coming off a bye week should be another available option to us. But if they're not, you can go ahead and pivot on to potentially playing the Carolina Panthers, our number 3. The Panthers have put up 10 and 9 fantasy points in the last 2 games. Of course, putting up a pretty good defensive performance against Lamar Jackson and that Baltimore Ravens offense. Now they take on the Denver Broncos. For the 8th time this season, the Denver Broncos have been unable to put up more than 17 points. That happened last night, of course, against the Las Vegas Raiders, in which they lost in overtime. Overall, I think the Carolina Panthers defense will be able to lock in, of course, stop Russell Wilson and put together another great week here in terms of fantasy point production. That's going to cover it for me today in terms of waiver wire potential prospects going into week 12. If anything changes, we'll of course mention it in tomorrow's video in terms of some potential waiver wire pickups. But before we conclude today's episode, I want to go over a couple entries via PrizePicks that I'll be making later tonight via the Monday Night Football game. So let's go ahead and check that out right now. So as you can see to the right, we have PrizePicks here in terms of tonight's Monday Night Football game. So first and foremost, we want to talk about this potential entry of 0.5 receiving yards, and you can go ahead and potentially make this entry on any given play within the next 80 hours. So up until, of course, the Thursday night Thanksgiving games, in which we have the night game specifically, Justin Jefferson and the Minnesota Vikings taking on the New England Patriots. So if you're interested, obviously that is an automatic more, picking more on his total 0.5 receiving yards. If you're interested, go ahead, add that to your entry. If, again, you guys haven't checked out PrizePicks, use the link down in the description. And when you sign up and make a first-time deposit using promo code Andrew, your first-time deposit will be instantly doubled up to $100. So if you deposit 20, you'll be given 20. You deposit 50, you'll be given 50 up until 100. So if you're interested, check that out today. Thank you very much. So either way, in terms of the overall receiving yards, we're not going to talk about using Justin Jefferson in a Monday night overall entry. I would like to use that for Thursday. But as of tonight, the overall plays that I would like to go ahead and utilize, first and foremost, has to do with receptions. And it has to do with Brandon Ayuk. Brandon Ayuk, over the course of the last couple weeks here, has been incredible in terms of overall catches. 6, 6, 7, and 8. That level of opportunity obviously going in his direction as the primary outside of the numbers receiving option within this offense obviously makes him an automatic play in my eyes. I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to take that number. I'm going to pick more on it going into this upcoming week. Now, in order to complete an entry, you need to have 2 different teams of players potentially within a given slip. So what I'll go ahead and do is add the following player. Now, as of this current moment in time, as I'm recording in the morning, there are no overall receiving numbers for wide receivers on the Arizona Cardinals. Again, we know that Marquise Hollywood-Brown is not going to play. We know that DeAndre Hopkins is going to play. And the newest information is that Kyler Murray will not be active. So they're probably going ahead and tweaking their numbers. Any number that regards Rondale Moore potentially receiving yards or receptions as a whole, I'm going to be taking more on and putting a potential entry on that in tonight's Monday night matchup. But until then, I'll go ahead and introduce this to you guys. If you guys haven't checked this out, they're potentially picking more or less on terms of total rushing and receiving touchdowns between a pair of players. Of course, we could talk about Brandon Ayuk or George Kittle. Are they going to combine for a total of 1 touchdown, whether it's on the ground, through the air? Is that potential going to be there? If I'm looking at these players and thinking to myself, who has the highest upside for touchdowns amongst all these guys? It's Deebo Samuel and James Conner. These guys are touchdown fiends, and over the course of their careers have always found the end zone. As of this current moment of time, I'm primarily relying upon James Conner to be the that specific option that finds the end zone on a 1-yard rush. But Deebo Samuel, again, he has been eluding us some fantasy points as hopefully has himself a bigger performance tonight. We'll take the more on that, make this given entry, and close out today's video pretty much here. All right, that's going to cover it for me today. Again, if you want to put together some potential entries for Monday Night Football or potentially Thursday Night Football with the Justin Jefferson 0.5 receiving yards. Go ahead and check that out today. Use promo code Angie. Use the link down in the description to sign up today. Thank you, everybody. And until tomorrow, we'll be talking about some running back rankings and wide receiver rankings. I'll see you guys. Peace.